Hello, my name is Michael Devine. I'm a theater director, playwright, actor, essayist who works all over the world, 20 countries on 5 continents in 8 languages so far, with many more to come, I hope, including places that I take my Acadia students to through an organization I founded called the Center for Alternative Theater Training, or CAT, which goes to a different unique cultural center every year for a week-long intensive. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm here to talk to you about why theater matters. Whether you're a teacher or a student or a parent who's concerned that their child is about to make the worst decision of their lives by taking theater at university, I'm going to change your mind about that. And I'm going to do it by showing you something much more interesting than my face. I'm going to share a screen with you, and I'm going to show you a PowerPoint, which will actually help me make my point. So over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to explain why theater is not a luxury or a frill. People who study theater become many other things other than performers. They become lawyers, public policy analysts, events managers, public relations specialists, journalists, professors, and teachers. And that's just talking about the graduates from my program at Acadia. Change the slide, please. Now, I see an anxious parent on the other side of this screen with deep creases in their forehead and nails chewed down to the quick, staring at this and saying, isn't theater just for fun, for young people who need to grow up faster than ever? And to that I say, no. Theater is serious play. That's an actual term we use. Children learn almost everything through imitation, which is a form of play. Young people learn through play that is focused and has objectives. Adults who don't play don't learn. And in modern society, the ability to learn to adjust to a constantly changing environment is the most important job skill of all. Theater has always served a critical function in society. Theater-trained people have better than average interpersonal skills. They can read a room better than most people, understanding what the unwritten rules of an environment are. And they can spot problems and work collaboratively with others to solve them. Those are what industry calls transferable skills. They work in any field, and they produce leaders like our current Prime Minister, who taught drama at the high school level. I'm going to take you on a brief tour of theater's long history to demonstrate the many ways in which theater matters. Even now, in an increasingly digital age, the power of live performance to affect a community and to develop an individual remains strong. Mr. Slide, please. 2,400 or so years ago, the Greeks brought as many as 20,000 people together for all-day performances. Audiences laughed, they cried, they ate their lunch. They watched shows about people making mistakes and what the consequences of those mistakes could be. They watched entire communities, represented by the Greek chorus, jumping to conclusions and acting like a mob. Sounds like 2020 in what country that we know well. They watched characters blinded by ego or ignorance acting foolishly and laughed at them. This slide is a modern amphitheater that I've actually taken my students to in Greece. Now, no one wants to go to the theater to be taught lessons. That's a recipe for awful theater, the kind that probably tours to your school. The Greeks knew theater had to be entertaining to collect eyeballs and to affect people. They knew that entertainment doesn't mean a cheap laugh. The most entertainment people ever experience is when they get lost in another world, when they absorb without being conscious of absorbing. So they created plays with big conflicts, moral dilemmas, and outrageously foolish mistakes, and staged them with a little song and dance and some grand acting. Drama presented serious social conflicts and examined the role of the individual, your rights, your responsibilities, in keeping society healthy and functioning. Comedy performed the same job from a different angle, showing how ridiculous it is to think only of yourself or to give too little thought to social rules. Both drama and comedy's function is to ask questions and to leave those questions for each spectator to answer. Theater's not about answers, it's about asking the right questions. Okay, let's fast forward 1,000 years or so and talk about theater's role as a voice in the community. Now, by voice, I mean loud. I mean riots. I mean laws being passed. I mean people fighting and dying for the independence of their society. Theater history is about as interesting as history can get. and it's all about the same things we care about today. People have even been assassinated in the theater. Abraham Lincoln was chilling after a long day managing the American Civil War when he was shot in his box at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. The killer was John Wilkes Booth, a handsome young actor who sympathized with the South. After shooting President Lincoln, Booth jumped from the box down to the stage below, about 12 feet. But he snags the spur of his boot on an American flag on the way down and breaks his ankle. The show is still going on. Now, picture the scene. You're in the audience. You just heard what sounded like a gunshot. Then some fool jumps from a box onto the stage and screams in agony as he blows out his ankle. Then you watch him hobble across the stage, right through the stunned actors, out through the wings and into a back alley where he jumps on a horse and gallops away. You can't make this stuff up. 150 years later, in 2016, another politician showed up at the theater. American Vice President Mike Pence thought he was going to soak up the accolades on behalf of his daddy, Donald Trump. The show was Hamilton, a multiracial hip-hop musical about the birth of the American nation. What he got was a lecture from the cast, members of whom stepped forward and told him a little bit about how Trump's policies on immigration made them feel as people of marginalized communities. Pence couldn't take the criticism and walked out. Trump tried to rally his supporters and blamed the actors, telling them to stick to acting, just like some conservative commentators tried to tell LeBron James to stick to dribbling when he spoke out about Black Lives Matter. But actors never stick to acting. Acting is about asking questions of your community. Theater is a political act, even when there are no politics in it. But exciting stuff doesn't just happen at the theater. It can happen because of the theater itself. Case in point, the old Price Riots of 1809 in England. Believe it or not, this involved 88 days of riots and disturbances at the famed Covent Garden Theatre in jolly old London, England. The central characters were an out-of-touch actor-manager, a king who was a certified idiot, and a whole bunch of working-class folks who felt the theater was their community birthright and that it was being taken away from them. Ticket prices hadn't increased in 100 years. The manager, John Philip Kemble, who was also the most famous actor of his time, had just overseen a big rebuild of the theater after it burned down in 1808. Very expensive and paid for by the theater's richest patrons. Theater in those days was an egalitarian affair. In those days, the stage and the audience spaces were both lit, all the time, by candles. So the rich folk had to be on their best behavior, as they could be seen by the working stiffs in the pit. Not so after the renovation. Now, this may not seem like a big deal. Prices rise all the time, right? But to working folks, the theater was the biggest and best entertainment they had. After a 6-day, 72-hour working week, they deserved their theater. Many even knew Shakespeare's plays by heart and considered William S. to be one of them, a guy who'd risen from humble origins, never had a formal education, and never forgot his roots. 88 days of sheer mayhem, fist fights in the pit, people breaking into impromptu dances while the show was going on, the management hiring boxers as security thugs. One night, spectators climbed onto the stage, only for an enterprising techie to open the trap doors. Then come protests on the streets outside the theater. The government is spooked. The police move in. A crowd marches to Kemble's house to have a little chat with him about ticket prices. Surprisingly, he doesn't come out. Inside the theater during the shows, protesters sing, toss pennies, lemons, apples, horns, and pieces of ripped up pit benches. It's getting rough out there. After 3 months that cost him a fortune, Kemble backs down and keeps the price the same. Now, this wasn't the worst disturbance that ever took place at a theater by a long shot. In 1849, 31 people died in a New York riot fighting over 2 productions of Shakespeare's Scottish play. One featured a famous American actor, the other was a famous English actor. Now, believe it or not, this was the first big celebrity hissy fit fight between one old nation and one new nation. The old one, England, still felt a little superior to their American cousins, especially when it came to Shakespeare. The new country, sometimes known as USA, was still a little heated about who was an American and who was not, and still a little bitter at the English because, the War of Independence, 1776, the War of 1812, Boston Tea Party, all that stuff. Supporters of Edwin Forrest, the American actor, rioted in the streets until the police were brought in. The police were mostly Irish. Americans gave the Irish a hard time in those days. And the guys they were trying to control were mostly nativists who hated the Irish. So the fight was on. You may find it hard to believe that people would fight and be killed over the theater. But theater is about identity. It shows people who they are. That's why it matters. Another example of how theater is linked to cultural identity took place in Birmingham, England in 2004. A theater called the Birmingham Repertory produced a blistering black comedy called Baizti. Baizti means shame or dishonor in Punjabi. The play was written by a British Sikh woman, Gurpreet Kaur Bhatti. In Bhatti's play, set in a Sikh temple or Gurdwara, a young woman is raped by a man her mother believes is going to make a marriage match for her. Her mother then kills the guy. Throughout the play, the women of the Sikh religion are depicted as accepting their oppression by the men. They do all the menial tasks at the Gurdwara, such as preparing food and cleaning up. Their sons are depicted as Matthew McConaughey failure to launch adolescence. I know, this is a comedy. Well, leaders of the Sikh community, all men, naturally, didn't think so. They tried to have the City Council of Birmingham cancel the play because it was, quote unquote, hate literature. At the opening, there were protests outside the theater, and the glass facade of the building was smashed. Several protesters got in through the stage door and confronted the actors in their dressing rooms. Over the next 6 nights, feelings got pretty high. Sikh elders claimed the play was putting Sikhs in danger by making them look bad to the rest of British society. They also claimed sacrilege. They said that even using artificial versions of the Sikh holy book or sacred objects on stage was disrespectful. They claimed that the play should not be set in a Gurdwara. The reason? A Gurdwara is where you say it is if you're a Sikh. Sikhs coming to Britain in early days didn't have dedicated buildings to worship in, so wherever the holy book was and people came to pray, that was a Gurdwara. Of course, theater is make-believe. We're talking props and a non-realistic setting and no one coming to pray. It's a representation. For the Sikh leaders, that wasn't good enough. The Sikh community was divided about the play. Younger people were fine with it, older people, not so much. Older folks remembered the racism they'd been subjected to and weren't interested in a repeat. It became an international incident. Newspapers around the world covered it. Here's a question. Does a member of a cultural community have the right, in a free society, to produce a work of art that is fictional and which is critical of her own community? Would the response to the play have been different if the writer wasn't a woman and the elders all men? What's beyond argument is that a work of theater caused a major social disturbance in one of Britain's most visible minority communities. Theater mattered to them. Another theater artist who worked to give oppressed communities a voice was Augusto Boal. In fact, his form of theater is called theater of the oppressed. Beginning in the 1970s in Brazil, Boal began to work with groups of people who felt unrepresented in society, workers in factories, victims of abuse, youth in crisis. Through his concept of the spect actor, he gave them a voice. Boal's actors would come into a community and meet with locals. They'd choose a subject that was important to everybody. Let's say how a company, let's call it Amazon, refuses to let workers organize a union. Then Boal's actors would create a play where they would act out the situations the workers described. What happened next is the magical part. Then the actors would invite members of the audience on stage to play a part in their own drama. The idea was to get people acting rather than just complaining. On stage, faced with an actor playing their boss, they couldn't just pretend there was a gun and shoot him. They had to think about what the best approach or solution might be. They were taking control of their lives. Boal's approach is spread all over the world. There's a whole branch of theater called Theater for Social Change, or Applied Theater. Acadia grads working with me have gone all over the world, working with communities in the way that Boal did. I've worked on a patch of dirt in Uganda, in Ghana, in Lebanon, Kosovo, and many other places, creating theater that is about the issues and lives of the people who live there. Theater matters to these people. It's about them, and it helps inspire hope. One final example of how theater matters. The Czech Republic is a country in Central Europe. After World War II, it was under the control of the Soviet Union, a communist bloc of nations. In 1989, in what was called the Velvet Revolution, the Czechs broke away from the Soviet Union. Who organized the revolution? Theater artists. One night in November, a student ran into a theater. He'd just been at a protest organized by theater and film students. The police had beaten them brutally. So here he was, bloody and bruised, running into a theater in the middle of a show. What did they do? They put him in the show. They invited him on stage, and he described what had just happened. The next day, every theater company in the capital, Prague, met and agreed to go on strike. But they kept the theater buildings open and used them to invite the public in for meetings on what to do next. Soon, word was spreading, and thousands of people were massing in the streets. The authorities didn't know what to do. The theater companies formed a political party, Civic Forum, and elected a playwright, Václav Havel, as their leader. He appeared a few days later in the main square, and 500,000 people showed up. The authorities knew the game was up and soon began to transfer power to Havel and the Civic Forum. Havel established a democracy and became maybe the only playwright ever elected president of a country. The Velvet Revolution took that name because the theater artists managed to pull it off without violence. A completely peaceful transfer of power from a ruthless oppressing force to a democracy. That's quite an achievement. And that's why theater matters. I want to thank you for taking this tour for me through some examples of why theater matters. It's always mattered because theater is about people at its essence. It teaches us all the skills we need to succeed as people and as citizens. It brings joy and hope and sometimes sticks a pin in our delusions and pretensions, and that's necessary too. Now, go out there and do some theater. Thanks for watching.